The US President and the leader of North Korea have signed what they call is a comprehensive document that will lay the blueprint of ties between the two sides that have been practically at war for over 6 decades. Details of that joint statement claim that the President has committed to provide security guarantees to the DPRK, and that Chairman Kim Jong-un reaffirms his firm and unwavering commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The two leaders agreed to establish new relations to promote long-lasting peace. The US and the DPRK will work to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. It goes on to add, North Korea, meanwhile, will work towards complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The two countries expressed their commitment to recovering prisoners of war, including missing in action. These are American soldiers who were killed during the Korean conflict, including the immediate repatriation of those already identified.
Thank you. Absolutely, I will.
Ambassador Arun Singh has been with us all morning, and he's still with us. Thanks so much, Ambassador, for staying through. We're expecting the press conference in maybe another 27 minutes or so if it goes according to schedule. But this particular document, it's the second para and the last line there, where both commit to security guarantees, that's America, and DPRK, North Korea, commits to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
So I think that's the crux of the deal. Clearly, the summit was important for both leaders, for President Kim in terms of normalization of his dialogue process with the US, for President Trump to show that he can do a big deal and play in terms of optics back home. So as part of that, the key deal that has been worked out is the US commitment to provide security guarantees to DPRK. Because in DPRK's case, it has been argued that they have concerns related to regime security, regime stability, and that they have always argued that the policies they have been followed has been in response to what they say is adversarial and hostile posture of the United States and their presence. So that's one. And the counter sort of offer from the North Korean side is reaffirming, so not a new commitment, reaffirming what they did in the Panmunjom Declaration when he had met the South Korean leader, reaffirming the commitment to work towards full denuclearization of the entire Korean Peninsula. And it's not just denuclearization of North Korea.
He's not saying I'm giving up or committing to give up my nuclear weapons only.
That's right. And that there has to be some kind of matching action by the United States in terms of its presence in South Korea, in terms of its presence in the waters around South Korea, in terms of the nuclear umbrella that it provides to South Korea and Japan. So there has to be some matching commitment. So we have to see now how this process plays out, because now the real challenge will be in putting details and content into the process playing out, what the expectations are, what is the economic and other assistance also that North Korea will want. And in the US, a lot of critics would argue that the commitment that the US has made on the Korean nuclear issue, how does it compare with the action that President Trump has taken on the Iran nuclear issue? Because in the Iran case, Iran had made certain commitments. It had shipped out its enriched uranium. It had reduced its activity.
That 36 UN nuclear watchdog snap inspections in 1 year last year.
That's right. And there was actual inspection and verification regime going on. So the question would be that in North Korea's case, what kind of caps, limitations, rollback, inspection regime will be in place? All that will come in future. And if those don't compare favorably with what was worked out in the Iran case, the president and his administration will come in for criticism. So clearly there is a positive step that has been taken in terms of reducing tension, in terms of getting a process going with the North Koreans and the United States. But the details still need to be fleshed out. And those have not.
Those details, in fact, we'll go into in a little bit, but let's just look at what's happened so far this morning since about 6 when both leaders left their respective hotels. They came, they saw, they discussed. So the leaders of the US and North Korea having that meeting in Singapore after months of trading barbs and insults. President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un first shook hands with each other before the summit at a luxury resort in neutral Singapore. The leaders of the two nations, which have practically been at war for over 6 decades, then held a one-on-one discussion with translators, which lasted for about 45 minutes, following which delegates from both the nations joined the two leaders to discuss what has now been signed, a joint declaration. President Trump was joined by his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and John Kelly, the White House Chief of Staff, for the expanded talks, while Kim Jong-un's team included former military intelligence chief Kim Yong-chol, who had traveled to the White House for meetings before the summit, Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, and Ri Su-yong, the vice chairman of the ruling Workers' Party, who has been involved in meetings on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. They then broke for lunch, a lavish spread of Western and Asian cuisine. Following the three-course meal, the two leaders signed that declaration that we were discussing, one that could lay the blueprint for ties between the two nations. Later, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted saying that he has spoken to the foreign ministers of Japan and South Korea to inform them about the summit. Mike Pompeo tweeted, "I just spoke with Foreign Minister Kono and Foreign Minister Kang to provide a brief readout of today's meeting between POTUS, the President of the United States, and Chairman Kim at the Singapore summit."
Thank you very much. So we're signing a very important document, a pretty comprehensive document, and we've had a really great term together, a great relationship. I'll be giving a news conference at 2:30, which is in a little bit less than 2 hours, and we'll discuss this at great length. In the meantime, I believe that they'll be handing it out on behalf of Chairman Kim and myself, and we're both very honored to sign the document. Thank you.
우리가 매우 중요한 문서에 서명을 하게 될 것입니다. 이 문서는 굉장히 포괄적인 문서이고 오늘 굉장히 좋은 아주 훌륭한 회담을 가졌고 또 아주 좋은 관계를 구축하였습니다. 2시 반, 즉 다시 말해서 약 2시간 후에 나는 기자회견을 할 예정입니다. 거기서 좀 더 자세하게 말씀을 드리겠습니다만은 일단 그 와중에 그동안에는 발표문이 기자들에게 배포될 것으로 알고 있습니다. 감사합니다.
Would you like to say something to the press?
우리는 오늘 역사적인 이 만남에서 지난 과거를 덮고 새로운 출발을 알리는 그 역사적인 문건에 서명을 하게 됩니다.
Today, we had a historic meeting and decided to leave the past behind, and we are about to sign a historic document.
세상은 아마 중대한 변화를 보게 될 것입니다.
The world will see a major change.
오늘과 같은 이런 자리를 위해서 노력해 주신 트럼프 대통령께 사의를 표합니다.
I would like to express my gratitude to President Trump to make this meeting happen.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay.
Mr. President, did he agree to denuclearize first?
We're starting that process very quickly. Very, very quickly. Absolutely.
Mr. President, 100% denuclearization? Did you talk about auto-warm beer, sir?
Mr. Kim, did you agree to give up your nuclear arms?
You'll be seeing everything in just a little while. The letter that we're signing is very comprehensive, and I think both sides are going to be very impressed with the result. A lot of goodwill went into this, a lot of work, a lot of preparation. I want to thank everybody on both sides, Secretary Pompeo and all of his counterparts. They were absolutely fantastic.
네, 조금 후에 우리가 서명한 발표문의 내용에 대해서 꼭 알게 될 것입니다. 아까도 얘기했습니다만은 매우 포괄적인 그러한 문서이고 양측이 그 결과에 대해서 굉장히 만족할 만한 결과입니다. 이 문서를 서명하고 또 이러한 만남을 갖기 위해서 많은 사람들이 전의를 가지고 노력했고 또 많은 준비 작업이 있었습니다. 그 양측의 그러한 작업을 해주신 분들에 대해서 감사드립니다. 거기에는 폼페오 장관뿐만 아니라 조선 측의 그러한 여러 참여자분들에게 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you a little bit later. And we're very proud of what took place today. I think our whole relationship with North Korea and the Korean Peninsula is it's going to be a very much different situation than it has in the past. We both want to do something. We both are going to do something. And we have developed a very special bond. So people are going to be very impressed. People are going to be very happy. And we're going to take care of a very big and very dangerous problem for the world. And I want to thank Chairman Kim. Spent a lot of time together today, very intensive time. And I would actually say that it worked out for both of us far better than anybody could have expected. I think far better. I watched the various news reports. I would say far better than anybody even predicted. And this is going to lead to more and more and more. And it's an honor to be with you. Very great honor. Thank you. Thank you to all of your representatives very much.
오늘 둘 다 뭔가 이루어내려고 싶어하고 또 둘의 특별한 관계가 오늘 시작되었습니다. 그리고 우리는 아주 여러 가지 중요한 여러 가지 문제의 해결에 시작을 했다라고 말씀드릴 수가 있습니다. 김 위원장님께 감사드리고 또 내가 보기에는 오늘 만남이 누가 기대했던 것보다 또 누가 예측했던 것보다도 좋은 만남이고 좋은 결과로 이루어질 것 같습니다. 또 앞으로 더 많은 진척이 있을 것 같고 이렇게 만나게 된 것을 영광으로 생각합니다. 김 위원장님 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Will you invite Chairman Kim to the White House?
Absolutely, I will.
Mr. Kim, would you like to come to Washington?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Well, this is a press conference that is scheduled in another 17 minutes in Singapore. I'm not sure whether it's running on time, but this is the venue of the press conference, and it's possible that President Donald Trump himself might address that press conference, or at the very least we expect Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to be there, as he had briefed the press before the summit. That venue hasn't filled up, so we're not sure when exactly that press conference will begin, but we'll get you that live as soon as it begins. Going back to Ambassador Arun Singh, Ambassador, you were talking about the details which will now have to be worked out in terms of both these commitments that the sides are looking at. But we were both, when we were off air, looking at earlier agreements, the 1993 agreement, which seems slightly more specific in terms of guarantees of security, when it says that the two have agreed in principle to assurances against the threat and use of force, including nuclear weapons, peace and security in a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, including impartial application of safeguards, mutual respect for each other's sovereignty. So what's different between what was reached then and what has reached now?
So those guarantees were there. I think the additional factor in the 1993 agreement was the agreement on safeguards and therefore an inspection regime. And at that time, on the nuclear issue itself, North Korea had also committed that it would suspend any efforts towards walking out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this agreement is at the moment a more general agreement. Yep. It looks at the overall relationship. Second, it's signed by the leaders of the two countries. That was a statement not signed at that level. So it is signed by the leaders of the two countries, and it sets a broader direction for the bilateral relationship, not just on the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue is one component of that, because it talks about establishing new US DPRK relations, building of a lasting and robust peace regime. So those aspects come in. Sure. And then, of course, looking at regime security guarantee and commitment for denuclearization. The other point I want to make is that President Trump now owns this process. Because in the US, as new presidents come in, they take positions on some of the ongoing issues. And either they allow the past practice to continue, in which case they don't really own that process, or they change the policy. For example, President Obama had tried to change the US policy on Afghanistan and on Iraq. Subsequently, he was responsible. Now, so far, President Trump, at least in the international context, has largely been walking back from US commitments, be it in NATO, be it in G7, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Paris Climate Change Accord. Now, this is a process that he now owns. This policy he now owns because he has taken that step. And therefore, how it plays out in terms of the kind of reassurance he gives to the leadership in North Korea, in terms of the commitment he gets on the denuclearization issue, he will be responsible for, and that's how the systems in US and internationally will assess him. So it's a high stakes game now, and let's see.
High stakes game. So if he's owning this process and responsible for it, he should be responsible for both for the bouquets or brickbats that he gets. But reactions, as we've been pointing out, have started coming in. China has reacted to the summit. Its Foreign Minister Wang Yi says that Beijing played a unique role to bring President Trump and Kim Jong-un together. However, the foreign minister was quick to point out that denuclearization should be full and North Korea's security concerns should be addressed.
这个核问题，一方面当然要实现无核化，而且是全面的无核化，同时，那么也要建立起半岛的和平机制，解决朝鲜方面的合理的安全关切。我想，任何人都不会怀疑中国在其中所发挥的非常独特的和重要的作用，而且这种作用还会继续发挥下去。
Surya Gangadhar now joining us from the WION newsroom. Surya, we saw in the run-up to this summit lots of obstacles that had come in the way. President Trump at one point even blaming China for that. Kim Jong-un going to meet Xi Jinping twice in China before the summit. Now China is making it clear, the 3 points that it's made clear there. One, it played a role in this summit. Two, there should be complete denuclearization on the Korean peninsula as a whole.
I think the Chinese are basically making clear their own interests, perhaps reminding Kim Jong-un that they've been a vital factor in these entire negotiations. They've been supportive of Kim Jong-un. In fact, the reports are they've even relaxed sanctions on North Korea. And also the reference to denuclearization. Now, the general sense is that only the North has nuclear weapons. But the point here is that even the Americans have nuclear weapons. I mean, they have a huge military presence in South Korea. There's a constant traffic in ships and aircraft, and for all we know, they have tactical nuclear weapons on board. In that sense, when one talks of denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, there's also an indication here that the Americans may also have something to contribute in that sense.
Right, and also in the run-up to the summit, there were a lot of analysts who were saying that Kim Jong-un was playing for points vis-a-vis China and playing the US for that. But now it seems that he will be looking at a longer-term relationship like North Korea has had in the past with China.
In fact, the statement that's come out is full of generalities, you know. When one looks back at the 1993 joint statement between the Americans and the North Koreans, it was far more specific. It identified a lot of areas where they're going to move forward on. It talked of no first use, it talked of denuclearization, it talked of reunification of the Korean peninsula. I mean, if you compare that with what we have come up with today, I mean, it's so full of generalities and leaving everything to some future negotiations. One wonders really what the Americans have won in this.
Well, this is Foreign Minister Wang Yi who says that China has played a unique role to bring President Trump and Kim Jong-un together. And we can confirm now from the State Department that it will be US President Trump who will be addressing the media.
解决这个核问题，一方面当然要实现无核化，而且是全面的无核化，同时，那么也要建立起半岛的和平机制，解决朝鲜方面的合理的安全关切。我想，任何人都不会怀疑中国在其中所发挥的非常独特的和重要的作用，而且这种作用还会继续发挥下去。
Well, that's Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi reacting to today's developments. Now, it has been confirmed. We saw the seal also on that media availability, it will be US President Trump who will be addressing the media shortly. But China, as you were pointing out, pretty much on expected lines, their reaction, we saw how South Korea had reacted as well.
So China's reaction, I think, along expected lines, because you recall that Chairman Kim had visited China twice. Yeah. Before making his moves with South Korea and the US, because he wanted the Chinese on board. And he wanted to also show to the others, including the Americans, that he had Chinese support, because that strengthened his position. And China would certainly want a reduction of tension between US and North Korea. It would like the opportunity to resume normal trade and economic activity with North Korea. Regime destabilization and refugee outflow from North Korea is not something that China would want. And as part of the process moving forward between North and South Korea, or North Korea and the US, China would want a reduction of US military presence on the Korean Peninsula. And therefore, they would certainly like to use this process to achieve that. They had objected very strongly to the location of THAAD missiles in South Korea and had taken action against South Korea for that. So I think there'll be many players now who will have a stake in this game and will try to influence the process as it goes forward.
You've seen the US Secretary of State, who has already called up his counterparts in Japan and South Korea and informed them of what has gone down. We expect the North Koreans would be doing something similar with the Chinese as well. The pictures you're seeing live on your screen there are of what will be very shortly President Donald Trump himself addressing the media before he leaves Singapore. He will be returning on a different platform to Singapore at the end of the year. That's on a bilateral with the ASEAN summit. But here he is going to take probably some questions as well, which will be interesting to see how he reacts to any questions about the outcome of this and whether it is exactly how he wanted it to pan out. But as you've been pointing out, at least President Trump, you saying he owns this process and no one can take away from him on that front. But there will be certain domestic constituencies that he will be trying to address and possibly in his manner overplay what he has achieved in this summit.
So very fact that he's coming to do the press conference itself, that he wants to own it even more and take credit for whatever has been worked out. And it is important for him to play that to his constituency, because he wants to signal back home that I am different, I can do better than what other US presidents have done. No US president has worked out this kind of optics of a deal with North Korea, especially at a time when he's under criticism for bringing in an element of an adversarial relationship in the relationship with many of their allies in the G7, NATO and other places. So he would certainly like to play that up. And that's why I think this summit has been made a success. Because as we were discussing, if you look at the text of the joint statement, there's nothing really substantive in this beyond keeping a process going. But he needed to show that this was a success, and he needed to show that he was doing something positive when other things were really being broken down. And I recall that when he announced that US was walking out of the nuclear deal with Iran. At that time, he said that our Secretary of State is on his way to North Korea for discussions there. So again, he was playing that out, that all I'm doing this, but there is something positive that I'm creating. So I think for his own projection, this is an important
step. But if he's doing that, so will analysts and his opposition, the Democrats in the US, again place the Iran nuclear deal vis-a-vis what has been reached so far at least.
That will be done. And of course, he will argue that the content of the deal still remains to be worked out, that I have started a process. You cannot really compare it with the Iran deal, because the Iran deal was very specific. We have to see what is worked out. But the critics would argue that in the Iran deal, there were very specific commitments. Where are the commitments here? But again, vis-a-vis Iran, the difference that we have to see is that when they look at the denuclearization in the North Korean context, they could also look as the issue related to the missiles, because the delivery systems are part of the challenge that the US sees. Whereas in the Iranian context, that issue had not been addressed. The second was that in the US, there has been concern related to what they see as Iran's policies in the Gulf region. In Yemen, in Syria, vis-a-vis Israel. In the North Korean context, those challenges are not there except vis-a-vis South Korea. And South Korea is very much supportive of this process.
Sure.
So there's a little bit of a difference between the two. At the same time, people will be wanting to know as to, on the nuclear issue itself, what is the kind of capping, rollback, verification mechanisms you put in place, which is stronger than that was in the case of Iran, and that could be quite a challenge.
Well, the next steps, it seems, after this press conference, of course, which will be interesting, is again laid out in that document where it says that Secretary Pompeo and a relevant high-level North Korean official will meet at the earliest possible date to implement the outcomes of the summit. So it shifts now to Mike Pompeo and the North Korean official?
That's right. So Secretary Pompeo, along with his counterparts in North Korea, would now need to put more flesh into this to see that when you're looking at security guarantees, what is the North Korean expectation in terms of security guarantees? What are the details? Similarly, on the denuclearization issue, what are US expectations and what are North Korean expectations, and how do they put that into print and in terms of choreography of action? So those will be very difficult negotiations.
And again, Ambassador, when you're saying that Donald Trump wanted to and has now successfully owned this process, and it is a process he will address hopefully some questions as well, apart from giving his take on the whole issue, does that mean that he's even more invested in the success of this, as in getting it to fruition, not just the summit itself, but since he is the one who owns it, ultimately it will be he who has to get either the bouquets or the brickbats?
So yes, you're right. He is the one who has to get the bouquets or the brickbats. He owns the process and he'll need to show success. And therefore many others will now try to see how can they exploit that. If President Trump needs to show success, then North Korea will want to see what is the minimum they can give, maximum they can extract, and which President Trump is able to live with, because he needs to show success. And China will play the same game. But President Trump being President Trump the way he has done, after a while he could very well say, well, it's not going on, I tried my best, and then move on. So he does bring in that element of unpredictability and is able to make an argument to suit his case, whichever way it goes. So we'll have to.
They say his attention span is not a very large, so to speak, but this summit, as you've been pointing out, there's been a lot of homework that's been done. It was projected as a historic one. It has ended up in that sense, at least in optics, between the two leaders, and a seeming change in position of both countries, or at least leaving the past behind. In that sense, it has done that. As you've been pointing out, the homework that has been done was for these particular optics. Now that has been successful, so now it will now shift to not only Mike Pompeo, but to myriads and several, possibly hundreds of people who will be looking at nuclear issues, disarmament issues. The UN has offered to be involved if verification is agreed to between both sides.
Well, ultimately it will be a US-led process, and the US will try to play it in terms of their own requirements. And as you mentioned, and as has been mentioned in the document, Secretary Pompeo will lead the process on the US side. But people in the US will be watching very closely. The analysts, the disarmament, non-proliferation hawks, and the US Congress. Because in the US system, the US Congress is a co-equal arm of government. So the US House of Representatives and the US Senate will be watching that process very closely. And there the critics of the president will be waiting to see as to how demanding he is vis-a-vis what President Obama had achieved. So I think it will be a very complex game that will play out. And the Europeans will watch the process. Because in the 6+1 talks, they had some role. And they will also be wanting to watch the process to see how does this evolve compared to how US walked out of the Iran nuclear deal.
If you think, again, this is going to be a US-led process, we've seen China's reaction. How does China get more involved in this process? Is it only what goes on between China and the North Korean leader behind closed doors? Or how does that pan out?
So I think in the beginning, China will of course talk behind the scenes with North Korea. China will also be speaking to the United States. In the past, President Trump has himself said that he's talked to President Xi to get some progress on North Korea. And the US will want to use China also to try and pressurize on North Korea. Now, if that is happening, how does China leverage its own relationship with the US on trade and other issues? So all those will come into play. And eventually, if there is an agreement on inspections, at that stage the IAEA will come into play to carry out the inspection regime as they did in the case of the Iranian agreement.
Somebody we haven't talked about very often today is who was watching this closely, of course, the South Korean President Moon Jae-in, who was closely responsible for getting the whole world to the stage that it has now. They will be, especially his regime and the people, will be extremely relieved at how it's going in terms of peace on the Korean Peninsula.
They would certainly be very relieved, because this was an issue he had taken up during his own presidential campaign. He was very much in the lead on this. It was South Korean representatives who persuaded President Trump to look at a summit after some of the discussions they had in North Korea. And when President Trump had sent that letter recently to the North Korean president cancelling the summit, it was South Korea which again activated itself to get that process going again. And after the letter, the South Korean president and Chairman Kim had a meeting at the demilitarized zone. So they played a very important role. And if this process goes forward, the South Korean president would also be a political beneficiary. Beyond the fact that it will lead to a reduction of tension on the Korean Peninsula, it can ease up some processes related to visits among family members, reunification of families, and some trade and economic flows between the two countries. So that is something they would certainly welcome.
We're expecting the president to step up to the podium any time, because all senior officials have been seated. We saw Secretary of State Mike Pompeo arriving a short while ago. I did see the White House chief as well, Mr. Kelly, and Sarah Sanders is also there. I didn't see John Bolton, but that doesn't mean he's not there. I just might have missed those visuals. Of course, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, extremely controversial all through his political career, had raised North Korean hackles when he had compared the process to denuclearize North Korea with the Libyan model, in which Muammar Gaddafi had given up his weapons of mass destruction, and years later, that was on the instance of the US, and years later, with covert US support, opposition groups militant groups had in fact even killed Muammar Gaddafi, and the North Koreans were extremely upset about that. But John Bolton was still present during the delegation level talks. We're expecting the president to step up to that podium extremely soon, because both Mike Pompeo and the Chief of Staff of the White House have already come in and are seated there. This message, of course, will be going out to the world, what President Trump does, but I'm not sure whether he's actually manufactured this to such an extent that he's chosen primetime US as well, but it is also a message that will be closely watched in the US.
Sure, because if you saw the first encounter with Chairman Kim was at 9 a.m. Singapore time, which was 9 p.m. in the US, prime time in the US. So I think some of the choreography was clearly related to it playing back home at the right time.
Some analysts were even comparing, say, President Obama, who would have red-eye flights. So they would, if they were having summits or bilaterals, any kind of meetings, they would actually land early in the morning, 8 or 9 a.m., and then have a 14-hour-long working day, I beg your pardon. Here, whether it was choreographed or not, just interesting to point out that the American delegation led by Trump had a lot of time before the actual summit took place, and like you're saying, it happened at primetime US television time as well.
That's right. It happened at prime time, and then the two delegations were present in Singapore for 36 hours before the meeting took place. Of course, it can be argued that that gave an opportunity for function level discussions between the two sides to tie up any things that loose ends that may have remained at the end. So that provided that opportunity, and of course it gave the US delegation to prepare well and project it at prime time.
And again, we have no idea how this is going to pan out, as we've had no idea how we've already got here in the last 5 months. But looking at the cycle of the Nobel Peace Prize and when it's actually announced, the Republicans have already started raising President Trump for Nobel Peace Prize, and many analysts say this is one of his key goals as well. Moon Jae-in is somebody who could also be looked at in that sense, but how would the Nobel Peace Prize pan out in terms of the people who choose that, and how this process is actually just starting now?
So it's been sometimes unpredictable, sometimes controversial. For example, President Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 for being what he was and what he represented through his election, without any major contribution by then in terms of any global peace related achievement. So that was one element. For the Israel-Palestine agreement in 1993, the Israeli leaders and Yasser Arafat were given the Nobel Peace Prize, and then the agreement collapsed later. So here the issue would be, who gets a Nobel Peace Prize? Does President Trump get it? Does President Trump, the President of South Korea and the Chairman of North Korea, all three get it? Would President Trump like to be clubbed along with the other two? And does the agreement and the process survive till the time the Nobel Committee takes its decision?
Exactly.
So I think there are many issues, but certainly it is a historic process, a historic step that has been taken, because it is the US which has been reluctant to take steps towards normalization of the relationship with North Korea because of how it perceived some of the policies of the regime, including on issues related to human rights and the kind of government that is there. But now that they have been politically able to take that step, it's certainly a process which has a lot of possibilities, but we have to see how it evolves.
The last point that you were bringing up, do you think now that the priority has been reached by the US, by President Trump, as to get this kind of an agreement, at least issues like human rights would come up a little later? How does it work?
Well, I feel if they do come up, they'll probably pro forma, because the present US administration, beyond pro forma, has not really been highlighting human rights issues, unlike some of the previous US administration. And in terms of their own domestic policies, they can be criticized for issues related to human rights. For example, some of the actions against immigrants. And they've been separating families as immigrants are coming out, children from parents. So they can be subjected to a lot of criticism on human rights related issues. And therefore, their capacity to raise it with others is something that can certainly be challenged. But given the kind of policy and projection that President Trump has been doing, talking about concerns of America, talking about not really interfering in the affairs of other countries, each country having the sovereign right to develop as it likes, I think he doesn't have the political compulsion to raise human rights issues, unlike some of the other presidents and administrations.
So did he not have the political compulsions? Why I'm asking you this is for a lay viewer. President Trump is portraying himself as someone who, unlike any other president in US history, has reached this far as North Korea and South Korea or the Korean Peninsula goes. What allowed him to do that, and what didn't allow previous presidents to reach this stage?
So in the case of President Trump, for example, there was a compulsion for him to show that he can do things differently. And he's been projecting that he's different from other US presidents. And therefore, he felt he could take this initiative, hold a meeting with the chairman of North Korea, and not be subjected to criticism that he couldn't deal with. Let's say there was President Obama having a similar meeting with Chairman Kim. He would not have been able to not raise human rights issues, because very much a part of his constituency was the human rights constituency in the US. President Trump doesn't have that political constituency, so he doesn't have the same pressure. Most other presidents in the US, when dealing with North Korea, would want a preparatory process so that they are not surprised at the last moment. And also President Trump has, over the past year and a half, developed the capacity to weather criticism of any kind, deflect it, challenge it, and other presidents have not been able to do that. So even though, if you look at the joint statement, there is not much substantive. It has possibilities going ahead, but not substantive at this stage. He can handle that criticism. Many other presidents would not have been able to handle it.
We're still waiting for that press conference with the US President Trump. I do believe some kind of a documentary is being played out at the venue currently with scenes from both North Korea and President Trump at the UN. I can see there Kim Jong-un as well. Pictures being played out as we wait for President Trump to address the press. We're not expecting the North Koreans to do anything similar either in, especially in Singapore. We're not sure what they will do once they return to North Korea. The president will, after this press conference, soon after, leave Singapore for the US. Again, when we talk about, we know the main players here is US, North Korea, of course South Korea, others involved very closely, and in China, Japan, the countries around that area. Where does India fit into all of this? We are of course watching it. We've seen what's happened in terms of nuclear non-proliferation between North Korea and Pakistan in the past, and missile proliferation. But apart from that, is that our only concern?
So, as you mentioned, Japan would be watching it very closely because they would have concern that any agreement that the US does with North Korea also takes into account Japan's concern. Because if the US only limits North Korea's missile capability, that it doesn't reach US soil but can reach Japan, and that would be certainly a matter of great concern. Also, there have been issues related to Japanese nationals who were abducted and taken to North Korea. How is that issue addressed? So they have their own concerns, including the kind of security guarantees that the US has given to Japan. In India's case, we have had concerns related to proliferation linkage and clandestine linkages between North Korea and Pakistan, with Pakistan giving them initially nuclear weapons technology and North Korea giving them missile technology. And that's something we have drawn attention to. And it is for that reason that we have maintained a presence and links with North Korea to keep dialogue going with that government. And you saw recently our Minister of State, Mr. V.K. Singh, had visited North Korea to keep the bilateral process with that country moving in a positive direction.
Still waiting for that press conference that President Trump will address before leaving Singapore after signing the joint declaration with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. All senior officials are present there. I did see your Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as the White House Chief of Staff Mr. Kelly, Sarah Sanders, the press secretary as well, and I do believe John Bolton would be there, though I might have missed his visual presence in that. There is a documentary of some sorts that's playing out while we wait for President Trump to address the media before he leaves. The proliferation issues were in the past. There's nothing in the future that India should be worried about. Is it, if this process goes forward in terms of denuclearization of the whole peninsula, but of course North Korea?
I think India would certainly welcome reduction of tension on the Korean peninsula, easing of relations, normal trade and economic relations happening. I think what India would be interested to see that in a medium and longer term framework, as this process plays out, what is the US posture in the region, especially in the framework of a growing Chinese posture. With China's economic growth, its military expenditure increasing, its military and economic footprint in the region growing. So how does that play out? And therefore, what does that mean in terms of freedom of navigation, including in the South China Sea? Because large part of our trade flows through South China Sea. Recently, the Indian Prime Minister was at Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore and gave a very important statement in terms of how India sees its role in the Indo-Pacific, relations with the ASEAN countries, with Japan, with the United States, with Russia also. So all that, how does that impact in terms of peace and stability in that region?